Now, the last session is devoted to Sherwin's theory of poetry, searching for a complete manifesto, and I invite Professor Goutam Ghoshal to come. Professor Goutam Ghoshal is a professor of English at Vishwabharati University at Shantiniketan, West Bengal. He specializes in the literature of Sherwindo, Shakespeare, Rabindranath Tagore, Hemingway, and Stephen Crane. He received his BA Honours and MA in English from University of Calcutta. In 1980, he completed another master's degree in journalism from University of Calcutta, followed by a PhD in 1984 from the same university. Professor Ghoshal is also the recipient of a Doctor of Literature degree for his pioneering work on Sherwin's prose style from Rabindra Bharati University in 1987. Professor Ghoshal has written several books and research papers, many of which focus on Sherwin's literature. He has also edited important books on Indian literature and world literature. One of his recent books, comparing Sherwindo and Rabindranath Tagore, was brought out serially in the journal Mother India. He has an extensive teaching experience, including more than 16 years at the prestigious Vishwabharati University.
Good afternoon, everybody. I especially thank Dr. Anand Reddy for giving me this scope of speaking, on which I have been working for quite some time. I've been trying to link Sri Aurobindo's The Future Poetry with his letters to K.D. Setna, which give us something of a complete glimpse of his theory of poetry or poetics. And it is and it is curious that my learning started with Dr. Reddy's father, V. Madhusudan Reddy, who also liked me very much, and I'm very happy to be here. After presenting my paper, I will speak over queries. The future poetry was a silent revolution between 1917 and 1920. Can you hear me? The future poetry was a silent revolution between 1917 and 1920 amidst the noise of loudly publicized modern poetic theories in favor of intellectual poetry. It was just the time when people in Europe and America were listening to T.S. Eliot's impersonal theory of poetry with great attention. In a little known corner of the globe and in a less known journal, Sri Aurobindo was then busy preparing the passage for man to move up to a new species. In the years between 1914 and 1921, he was absorbed in mighty experiential prose works, some of which were either moving together or stopping parallelly with the future poetry as installments in the Arya. The Life Divine stopped coming out as a serial in January 1919. Essays on the Gita in July 1920, the Synthesis of Yoga just a few months later in January 1921, the Psychology of Social Development in July 1918. The aesthetics proper and the half-developed theory of poetry came in the closing session of a great series, as if to give the final shape to the Aurobindonian worldview. Contrary to the common belief in our English departments, where the other major prose works are thought of as irrelevant to Sri Aurobindo's aesthetics and theory of poetry, I must say that his poetics can only be grasped thoroughly with reference to all his works, to his total view of life. This is not true that you read the future poetry and you know his theory of poetry and his poetics. You have to know all the works. How is the life divine related to art and poetry? Just a brief explanation from the future poetry will tell all. I quote, "Poetry and art, most of all our powers can help to bring this truth home to the mind of man with an illumining and Catholic force, for while philosophy may lose itself in abstractions and religion turn to an intolerant otherworldliness and asceticism, poetry and art are born mediators between the material and the concrete, the spirit and life. This mediation between the truth of the spirit and the truth of life will be one of the chief functions of the poetry of the future. Unquote. The future poetry is not just a search for mantric poetry. It touches on various planes of life, society, and culture in general. It starts with a focus on a lost poetry, then becomes a revised history of English poetry, and in the final chapter struggles keenly to define and characterize mantra and stop short of a total clarification despite his wonderful language encircling all the time the secret sources of overread poetry. Never was the language of poetry criticism such a unique blend of revelation and argument, poetry and logic, with the long drawn out Ciceronian, the suspended syntax, balanced by a cool, clarified statement. The future poetry will restore the element of sight and listening, the rhythmic speech, as it rose in the past from the heart of the seer and from the native home of the truth. The mantra will return with a more deliberate subjectivizing, a more deliberate exploration of the self. Talking of the evolution of society, Sri Aurobindo remembers the lost art and its distortion in the very first chapter of the human cycle, refusing to look on it as a notch gull of the mind and a reveal of intellect and fancy. The poets of the old days just saw and sang. Teaching, preaching, philosophizing, and sermonizing had nothing to do with them. In classical Sanskrit, the word kavi applied to any maker of verse, but in the Vedic Sanskrit it meant the poet seer who saw the truth and found in a subtle truth hearing the inspired word of his vision. Here are some significant highlights from the future poetry where he seeks to express the ultimate choice of a theoretician and a practitioner. I quote two relevant passages from the future poetry. But poetry is the mantra only when it is the voice of the inmost truth and is couched in the highest power of the very rhythm and speech of the truth. Unquote. The next is more significant and relates to the poetry of today. I quote, "But still all life is one, and a new human mind moves towards the realization of its totality and oneness." A new human mind. The poetry which voices the oneness and totality of our being and nature and the worlds and God will not make the actuality of our earthly life less, but more real and rich and full and wide and living to men. Unquote. It will be a mistake to consider this poetry as just revivalistic, as I just countered a little while ago, that this is not just revivalistic. It speaks of the future and it's a dynamic subjectivity. The future poetry speaks more about the present and the future than about the past. Here is another relevant passage. But now the mind of man is opening more largely to the deepest truth of the divine. Now, the self, the spirit, the eternal presence, not separate and distant, but near us, around us, and in us. The spirit in the world, the greater self in man and his kind, the spirit in all that is and lives, the Godhead, the existence, the power, the beauty, the eternal delight that broods over all, supports all, and manifests itself in every turn of creation. Unquote. The frequent use of the comparative degree in the future poetry, you will see again and again Sri Aurobindo speaking of more, more. Now, what is this more he is speaking about all the time? The frequent use of the comparative degree in the future poetry simply indicates the progressive awareness of the subjective self. The vision of the more is not just a mere comparative degree. Sri Aurobindo has a distinct perception beyond Tagore, Whitman, Carpenter, A.E. Yeats, Stephen Phillips, and other poets near to him. There is no mention about himself, simply because he was not practicing fully what he was preaching then. Between 1917 and 1920, he was not giving his best poetry then. But then he might be having a prescience of his own poetic output between 1926 and 1950. The poetry of K.D. Setna, Harindranath Chattopadhyay, J.A. Chadwick, Nirod Baran, and Nolini Kanta, and also of Themis and the Aurovillians poets of today, R.Y. Deshpande, and others working around us. Yet, there was something more to be said in the future poetry, which would have completed a very interesting poetics. The master yearned for revisions. He played the instrument masterfully, not that it was a very bad book, it was a wonderful book throughout. But still he was not satisfied. And he was struggling to express something which was yet beyond his reach. Not that he didn't know that. There was a problem in expression, I suspect. There was a problem in expression, and again he tries to define mantra and he fails in the future poetry. And it's not that he doesn't know that. I will clarify how. That he knew the thing, but he was not in a position to form that objective correlative. He played the instrument masterfully, but wished to tell something more. Something that was still beyond his reach, beyond the capacity of his expressive skill. Or maybe the thing he was trying to formulate took time to shape itself out with reference to his poetics. The knowledge about the plains was certainly there, as he had already spoken of them in the Life Divine. Not that he didn't know about the plains. 3 years back he was speaking of the plains in the Life Divine, around 1914. But somehow there was still a lack of integration. The excessive stress on the future poetry as a pointer to Sri Aurobindo's final theory of poetry has made the book quite popular at the expense of the full view of his aesthetics. Has made the book quite popular at the expense of the full views of his aesthetics, which only becomes clear in his post-1926 letters, especially the letters to K.D. Setna. In the last 9 chapters of the future poetry speak of significant overlooked areas, which confirm that Sri Aurobindo is not speaking of a revival, but of a dynamic subjectivity, following the expanding zones of human consciousness. Sri Aurobindo wished thorough revisions of the book, which could not be done and for which maybe the book remained unpublished during his lifetime. He must have failed the problem of objective correlative. In the book, and that could have been the reason why 24 of the book's 32 chapters received some revision at one time or another. Only once in the future poetry, that too very briefly towards the close of the book, we get a lone reference to the overmind with a nearly accurate focus. I quote, "It will be first and most a poetry of intuitive reason, the intuitive senses, the intuitive delight soul in us, getting from this enhanced source of inspiration a more sovereign poetic enthusiasm and ecstasy, and then it may even be rise towards a still greater power of revelation, nearer to the direct vision and word of the overmind from which all creative inspiration comes." That is only the lone reference to the overmind in the future poetry. At no other place do you find that. Regarding the influence of the overmind on poetry, Sri Aurobindo does not say anything more beyond that. It is only in his letters to Mr. Setna that we see repeated references to and adequate explanations of the term overmind. It is curious that Sri Aurobindo had been talking of the overmind in the Life Divine in detail, with reference to the spiritual planes as mapped by him. We see just a brief reference to that in the future poetry, which started coming out in 1917, 3 years after Sri Aurobindo had begun serializing the Life Divine. There are frequent references to mantra in the future poetry, but we do not know as yet that the operating plane is the last summit of the mind, which either influences the style or the substance or both. Hence, much of Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry remains unexplained in the future poetry. Unless we read the letters to Mr. Setna, no clear view of mantric poetry or inspired poetry from comparatively low planes can emerge. Judged from this point of view, it will not be proper to call the future poetry the complete poetic manifesto of Sri Aurobindo. Yet the future poetry should be there, the whole of it, along with the letters in our search for the poetics of Sri Aurobindo. In an incomplete chapter entitled Mantra, which is now put in Appendix 3 in the latest editions, he made perhaps his last attempt to clarify the nature of mantra in the book. This time he was very close as he had been in the chapter The Word and the Spirit. Sri Aurobindo see that he is not very clear, he is struggling to express. Speech, the expressive word, has such a summit or absolute, a perfection, which is the touch of the infinite upon its finite possibilities and the seal upon it of its creator. This absolute of the expressive word can be given the name which was found for it by the inspired singers of the Veda, the mantra. The mantra is the word that carries the Godhead in it or the power of the Godhead. Still he is unable to locate the source. And yet this is far behind the post-1926 clarity which you see in the letters. Sri Aurobindo became a relaxed guru after 1926. Apart from that, the mother's influence might have been a significant force behind the clarity of his post-1926 letters. One suspects he learnt a lot about expressive skill from the mother's writings. There is an obvious change in his prose style in the 30s, and the progressive clarity reached a supreme height in the supramental manifestations upon earth. While writing the introduction to his overhead poetry, Setna shuns his complicated and exhaustive language and opts for clarity to explain the overhead aesthetics. I quote from Setna. The future poetry would be written from those rarer levels, whose voices have occasionally joined the utterances from the usual sources to make the profoundest moments of past poetry. The rarest of those levels give birth to overhead poetry. They are planes whose afflatus comes as if from an infinitude of conscious being above our brain-clamped mentality. Unquote. These commentaries are extremely helpful in our effort to tie up the scattered materials and for our own practice of criticism of overhead poetry, the poetry that comes from the overhead planes, the higher mind, the illumined mind, the intuition and the overmind. In these letters, Sri Aurobindo teaches us through Setna how to identify the sources. Starting from the voice of the self, the psychic poetry, and then going up from that gateway towards the spiritual planes. He clarifies the fluctuation of the influences. As there is no consistent influence of a particular source on the whole unit, he speaks of how the planes operate separately or mixed up in their touches on a line or lines. All overhead poetry cannot be called mantra, as the purest kinds come either by the overmind touch or by the touch of a very high spiritual intuition, which is a plane just below the overmind. Much of the supermind of substance percolates down to the overmind. Much of the supermind substance percolates down to the overmind, as all our colleagues from the philosophy and yoga psychology department branches present here know very well. And that could be the reason behind Sri Aurobindo's statement in the future poetry, which takes us by surprise because of its direct reference to the supermind. I quote, "The voice of poetry comes from a region above us, a plane of our being above and beyond our personal intelligence, a supermind which sees things in their innermost and largest truth by a spiritual identity and with a lustrous effulgency and rapture and its native language is revelatory, inspired, intuitive word, limpid or subtly vibrant or densely packed with the glory of the ecstasy and luster. Unquote. The most significant phrases, clauses, and sentences in these letters to Setna may be underlined, and by repeated readings of these letters, the perception has to be formed. Because this is not intellectual poetry. I was speaking of the difference of the poetry of today. They are not receptive to this because this is not intellectual poetry. It is basically anti-intellectual poetry. It goes against the theory of T.S. Eliot and others, all the moderns. A different kind of language habit will strengthen that perception. Sri Aurobindo frequently uses words and phrases like inevitability, absolute inevitability, supreme inevitability, inevitable word, revelation, etc. Sri Aurobindo's letters cited to Setna's overhead poetry complete the image of mantra and shows Sri Aurobindo's humility in statements like the following. See how humble he is. He writes to Setna, the mantra as I have tried to describe it in the future poetry. I couldn't, I have tried. The mantra as I have tried to describe it in the future poetry is a word of power and light that comes from the overmind inspiration or some very high plane of intuition. Its characteristics are a language that conveys infinitely more than the mere surface sense of the word seems to indicate, a rhythm that means even more than the language and is born out of the infinite and disappears into it. Unquote. The overmind expresses a cosmic consciousness even by its touch, as the full overmind inspiration rarely comes down upon human poetry. It may be a touch on the substance or the style of a line which may or may not have any relation with mysticism or spirituality proper, or it may affect both the style and the substance in its more powerful touch. Like the line from Dr. Foster's, where it is totally sensual. But Sri Aurobindo says Marlowe draws the inspiration from the overhead planes. Is this the face that burned 1,000 sheep and that launched 1,000 sheep and burned the topless towers of Ilium? It has nothing to do with spirituality. So this is how he explains and he characterizes, he gives indications that this is the way you have to understand and clarify overhead aesthetics. We must interact and we must try to know that this is a poetics which we have to use in practical life and it has to be communicated. Sri Aurobindo also speaks of a mental overmind as contrasted with the overmind proper, which has some Gnostic light in it. There are at least 4 divisions of the overmind in his letters to Setna. Mental overmind, intuitive overmind, true overmind, and supramentalized overmind. Sri Aurobindo frankly admitted to Setna that he was not in a position at that point of time to describe the workings of the overmind gnosis. He couldn't express. Sri Aurobindo stresses the point of feeling and perception, how to know, how to judge this. He stresses on feeling and perception because there is still a problem of objective correlative for the critic while dealing with lines that drop in from the overmind or from other overhead planes. There may be an inspired selection, an unusual bringing together of words, and obviously they come as discovery, refusing to be intercepted by the intellectual mind. They come as discovery. And somebody was talking of regional poetry. It is there in Bengali poetry, in Hindi poetry, in the popular songs of Bollywood, Pichkariyon mein rang bhara pyar hai, is rang mein jeevan bhar lo. That is a popular song from Kohinoor. And there you have that unusual arrangement, that unexpected discovery of words. And sometimes it comes just on a single line, on a clause even. Now, one cannot improve such lines like, the winds come to me from the fields of sleep. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep. No color, no ornamentation, no flash. But you can't improve such a line. It comes from the infinite. and disappears into the infinite. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep. And then there are other varieties. Charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn. That is from Keats. It's a more rich style. But it is there. There are different types of overmind influence on poetry. Despite the clarity in the letters to Setna and a detailed exposition of overhead aesthetics, there are important omissions or the issues were forgotten by Setna. Like the stress on the words song and the singer. Sri Aurobindo repeatedly uses the words singer, songs in the future poetry. Why? And why Rabindranath Tagore, who has nothing to do with English poetry? Why does Tagore come so frequently towards the close of the future poetry? Mantric poetry has a close kinship with song, and that seems to be a reason behind Sri Aurobindo's memory of Tagore, a singer poet from a regional language. While his discussion was centering around the flashes of mantra in the English language, he frequently brings in Tagore. Why was the Bengali poet so frequently remembered in the last few chapters of the future poetry? The old lights up the new in Tagore's songs. The old lights up the new in Tagore's songs. I have chosen just one example. I have still 15 minutes. 10 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. It's Aji Joto Tara Tobo Akashe, and my colleague has tried a translation. I'm just reading out the translation, then I will just give the highlight where I suspect that the highest is working. Huh? This is not Sri Aurobindo's example, but this is my example to show how it is working. Why is Tagore coming in a discussion on English poetry, along with Whitman and Carpenter? Why is Tagore tripping in? So the translation reads like this. The Ananda from all directions have attained a profound fragrance. Moving through my mind, it sweeps across your temple. Now I know no one anywhere. I hear nothing else, but the breath of the cosmos plays through my heart to the tune of a flute. Aji Joto Tara Tobo Akashe. And I have just highlighted those two lines, which let me express it. It is Dike Digante Joto Anonde Lohiache Ek Gobhir Gandho Amar Rochitte Milia Kotre Tomaro Mondire Uchhase. An unexpected and unusual arrangement of words and rhythm, and it voices the cosmic. Dike Digante Joto Anonde Lobhiache ek gobhir gandho amaro chitte mile ekotre tomaro mondire uchhase. Dike digante joto anondo lobhiache ek gobhir gandho amaro chitte mile ekotre Tomaro mondire uchhase. This is the climax of inspiration, these two lines. So, and the psychic is very obvious in that classic, Lata's classic, 1949 classic in Aayega Aane Wala Aayega. There's a great yearning in that song, an aspiration. But the substance is pure love, it's not spirituality proper. Aayega Aane Wala Aayega, that classic from Mahal from 1949. And even the composers, they were very simple men. But somehow the influence was working. It had already started working there, even in the popular songs. And not just Aayega Aane Wala Aayega, but in many songs of the 50s, Hrithik Roshan's grandfather, Naushad Ali, they could express the inmost through their hands, composers, and the poets and the musicians, they work together to create that. So in Tagore, it was something like a third art. Like the poetry was not his best poetry. In his best mantras, the poetry is not the best. And the tune is also not the greatest. But the fusion of the two, that created a third art. So that is what happened to Tagore. His best songs are not his best poetry. And his best songs are all mantras, one suspects. Now I conclude. The future poetry must be properly linked up with Sri Aurobindo's letters on psychic and overhead poetry to form a complete view of his poetics. Many of the lines from today's anti-Aurobindonian school unknowingly focus on Sri Aurobindo's theory of the overhead inspiration kissing the mundane substance. And I was talking of the most awfully anti-Aurobindonian poet, Nissim Ezekiel. He was the worst. He had the worst language for Sri Aurobindo. But see, there is a line he has written in Marriage where the substance is totally mundane, a couple walking. But listen to the line and just try to feel what is happening in the line. This is Nissim Ezekiel, the great anti-Aurobindonian poet of the 50s and 60s. As I have said, he said, anyone who thinks of Sri Aurobindo as a poet has no ear for the English language. But see how he has caught the vibration from a higher source. I don't pretend to locate the source, but see the line for yourself. It's a couple walking, a mundane substance. Wordless, they walked like a breeze. Wordless, they walked like a breeze. You see the vibration. The mundane catching the suggestion of the infinite is certainly not the end point in Sri Aurobindo's poetics. His more significant prophecies relating to the return of incantation in English poetry does not seem unreal for the poets writing from Pondicherry and Auroville. Let us wish the vibration to spread beyond these two cities. Thank you.